Welcome to our fifth videocast session of the Schaufler Lab at TU Dresden featuring guest speaker Shannon Mattern. My name is Johanna Grosche and I'm a PhD researcher at the Schaufler Lab. In past sessions of this format, my colleagues have already introduced the Schaufler Lab and our guiding theme, which is data worlds, socio-technical and cultural syntheses of new realities. Further information on the Schaufler Lab can be found on the website. If you haven't watched the other videocasts of this series, you can click on the link below, which I would highly recommend to do so since there are a bunch of exciting topics to check out. And now I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker for today, Shannon Mattern. Shannon has recently resigned from her position as the Penn Presidential Compact Professor of Media Studies with a secondary appointment in the history of art at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and is now the Director of Creative Research at the Metropolitan New York Library Council. She has been active in academia for 23 years and has held tenured full professorships in three fields, which are media studies, anthropology, and art history. Prior to her position at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, she worked at the New School in New York for 18 and a half years. She's the author of 4 books, which are The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities, Deep Mapping the Media City, Code and Clay, Dirt and Data, 5,000 Years of Urban Media, and A City is Not a Computer, and has also co-edited 4 collections on urban technology and quotidian media practices. Beyond her numerous other publications, she has advised over 70 graduate theses and dissertations, and designed and taught over 40 courses on topics ranging from urban technology, maps and information infrastructures to design, ethnography, local media, and critical university studies. Before we begin, a quick reminder that this session is going to be recorded and published online on the YouTube channel of the Custodie, Office for Academic Heritage at TU Dresden. This session will be structured in 3 parts. So first of all, Shannon will give a presentation, which will be about 10 to 20 minutes. Then we will have a moderated Q&A session. And lastly, we will stop the recording and enter an open discussion with the team of the Schaufler colleague. But without further ado, I will hand over the mic to Shannon, and I'm very excited to hear your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me, Johanna. I also want to thank you for being such a gracious and thorough and welcoming, hospitable host. It's been really lovely to work with you to think about planning this. And speaking of planning, I don't have a formal slide presentation for you. As you might know, things are rather calamitous in the United States right now, and that is on top of a few calamitous years of my own personal life. And Orit and I knew each other from the New School from several years ago, and that institution in particular, as beloved, it's fraught but beloved. It is going through a really tumultuous period right now with closures of lots of departments, severance of multiple faculty, a large percentage of the faculty being asked to leave, and those are all my friends. So this has been a really difficult few weeks of talking to people about what the next phase of their life is. Higher education is in a really difficult place in the US and around the world generally, but I think especially anomalously in the US right now. So what I did instead is I've structured this, I hope it doesn't seem too self-serving or selfish, is kind of like an intellectual autobiography, because I do think that going across the almost quarter century of my career, I have thought about data in relation to worlds in multiple different ways. And those permutations, that evolution has been shaped both by kind of my own evolving interests, frustrations, boredom, but also by institutional pressures, really being frustrated with people not paying attention to certain things or things not being funded, or by all this foundation and kind of non-for-profit money being pushed at certain topics that I think are maybe oversaturated, over-highlighted. So there are all kinds of personal and institutional and societal and ethical and political economic issues that have shaped my own work and kind of the evolution of the academy and institutions within which I worked over that quarter century. So I have a whole bunch of tabs open that I'm going to run through. That's kind of like, as I said, an intellectual autobiography. So I will start sharing. So this is my website. It's wordsandspace.net. I started it in 2002 with the help of a systems administrator boyfriend who kind of helped me hand code an original version of it. I now use a content management system that I have for about 15 years. But pretty much everything I'm going to be sharing with you today is on this website. As I said, it's wordsandspace.net. Some just on the front page, I have a highlight of like 6 or 7 recent things I've done, which in these two that just happen to be on the page right now, I think do a pretty good job of capturing the breadth of the way I've thought about data and worlds together. So at the top here, you see I spoke with 2 friends of mine, Tiga Brain and Sam Levine, who were, I guess you could call them creative technologists or critical engineers. They have a show up at Pioneer Works, which is a great kind of arts, culture, tech venue in Brooklyn that's all about climate hacking. So this is, I heard some folks in the introduction say they're interested in environment and climate and data, and their work is very pertinent. I hope you know of them. If you don't, I highly encourage you to take a look at their work. And then the one right below it, Design Index. For this, I was I guess you could call an artist or a scholar in residence. It was an invited position at the Cooper Hewitt, which is the Smithsonian National Design Museum, one of many beleaguered institutions, kind of a federally funded institution. So I was invited to go and just explore the library all summer and find an intervention. So I decided to focus on, because it was called the Design Index Residency, I decided to ask questions about what actually is an index. So that's everything from the index finger, being able to point at things, something that, especially in this age of kind of AI slop and just the kind of de-atomization, the kludging together of all kinds of data sources with generative AI. It's really hard for us to point at particular sources of accountability, to kind of put our finger on individual sources and test their veracity. So just this muddling up of the ability to point at and validate and give credit to in this age of AI slop is something that I think is called into question in interesting and problematic ways. So I looked at the index as a bibliographic genre, as a physiological unit, as a mode of organization, as an aesthetic, all these different permutations of what actually constitutes an index and how new technologies are changing those. And then the text for that talk is also on my website. So I'll start with where I began, and that was in a world where data takes multiple forms. I, having moved from a very tiny town in central Pennsylvania, a village of about 500 people next to a town of about 5,000 people, then came to New York City for graduate school. That was a bit of a culture shock in the best possible way. I became aware for the first time of how architecture serves as a communication medium. So I knew I wanted to write my dissertation about how architecture does that, what I just said. It serves as a communication medium, but it also, because I was in media studies and interested in kind of the physical manifestations of data, I wanted to look at a building type, an architectural typology that gave form to the way a community or a society values data, information, knowledge. So I chose public libraries. There was, of course, a robust system of public libraries around the city, unlike anything I had experienced growing up. So I went around the country. My dissertation was about the Seattle Public Library, designed by the Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas. And then for my first book, which you can see here, published by Minnesota in 2007, I got a grant to go around the country to 15 cities where they were designing new public library buildings in this age with the rise of Amazon, when supposedly this institution was dead because everybody had a, quote, internet in their pocket. This, obviously, people's experiences of data worlds are driven by political economic access, by technological accessibility, by decisions of paywalling or different types of access protocols. So people's data worlds in their own kind of that are available to their own personal access are shaped very much by all of these different borders in both physical and metaphorical senses of the term. So this institution, the public library, persists, and I've continued to write about it. My most recent article was actually about public libraries too, and how they serve as spaces for a public in an increasingly confusing and messy data infrastructure, a data infosphere or data world, are using their public libraries to make sense of and to collaboratively navigate through that very obfuscatory world. So this has been a theme throughout my work, and I will probably continue to write about it forever, but this was also my first book. And then just a couple other examples. This is like all the publications on my website. A lot of my other early things were related to issues that spurred out from my dissertation. So for instance, public design processes. How do you involve communities in designing physical spaces? How do you marshal public data, make them visible and intelligible to a community so that they can contribute to a design process? I also was really interested in data as something that is not only manifested in physical, tactile terms in the form of like books on shelves, for instance, or in data visualizations on screens, but also how it's sonified. So I had the good fortune of the new school of sharing an office with a musician and composer for my first 3 years, who really started to get me thinking about music and sound. I was a musician up through college and then set that aside because grad school takes away all of your time for hobbies. But I was really able to start thinking about sound again. So sound has been a theme. The sonification of data in space, in various kind of data worlds, has been a theme throughout my work too. Also, my research has been integrally informed with and dovetailed with in very kind of meaningful ways with my teaching over the years. So I have built a website for nearly all of my classes, and these also are exploring things related to data worlds. So I taught a 1 year studio course called Media Space Public Space, as you can see here. And for this, we then got a gallery, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. This was shortly after September 11th, so a long time ago, and there were still a lot of empty storefronts in downtown Manhattan. And they were trying to activate them by making them available for pop-up installations. So they, I don't know why, but gave our class, me with zero experience in exhibition design, a 3,000 square foot gallery right by the financial center, or the financial district, right in the financial district, that we were able to launch an installation, a totally student design curated installation, examining issues pertinent to data worlds, issues of privacy, publicity, kind of how data make themselves manifest in the landscape, the kiosks and interfaces we use to engage with the city's kind of data infrastructures. Another class about mediating spaces. This was about how architecture and information technology have informed one another for thousands of years, which then kind of became a seed for one of my future books. Then a little bit later, I started to work a lot with, this has now been a 14-year collaboration, Places Journal, which is an open access publication focusing on architecture, urbanism, and landscape, totally open access. And this has been the most rewarding, fruitful publication relationship in my career. So here, as you can see, my very first piece down here at the bottom right corner was about libraries. I was interested in how little libraries, little experimental, ad hoc, guerrilla, fugitive libraries were popping up around the city, in part because people wanted an antidote to or a way to counter the overwhelming datification and virtualization of their lives. So this was my first set of articles, first six. You can see where I'm moving from libraries here into the second piece about, this is the design of a publishing center in Korea, in the midst of a hyper digital state, hyper digital mode of governance. Orit has also done some work in South Korea. Here I wanted to look about the desire to maintain a fine publishing tradition in Korea amidst this proliferation of digital technologies. The next piece was about infrastructural tourism, and that was how can we, by exploring the world in an embodied, empirical sense, better understand these really hard to get at, hard to point our finger at, hard to index infrastructural systems. So can we visit the internet? Where does it live? How do we know what happens with our e-waste? Can we go to these places and sense them through our multiple senses? And then as you can see in the next row here, I start to get more into kind of more data-driven things. So the rise of data science is here, something I explore in this methodology piece. And then this interfacing urban intelligence is when I look at this is around the age when there were an explosion of experimental interfaces to help people understand the health of of urban systems. So a lot of digital dashboards, which I then explored further in this piece, the next year, called The History of the Urban Dashboard. Again, a lot of classes at the same time. We're feeding into this research where I'm doing classes on mapping, thinking about data artifacts and infrastructures. And I'll just show you some of those. I did probably 5 or 6 iterations over 20 years of a class called Data Archive Infrastructure, where we're looking at the history, politics, and aesthetics of organizing information, libraries, archives, experimental interfaces to digital repositories, the aesthetics of information, the furnishings we design to hold information. So all of these are creating both macro and micro scale worlds for holding data and information. So that's what this class was about. Also taught several iterations of classes about media. It's a little frustrating to me to see that a website that looked beautiful, where all these images fit perfectly into their squares in 2018, have since gotten a little bit messed up here. So I prefer that this be a little bit neater. But these are the glitches of kind of data decay. And this class is really, again, about the history, politics, aesthetics, and speculative possibilities of mapping. And because I was teaching in a media studies department, I wanted people to think about maps as media forms, as things that are can be produced on paper or sound or performance or audiovisually. There's also a huge industry about cartography too, just as there is a huge industry of media production and distribution. So we looked at things like indigenous cartographies, or how different spatial epistemologies, world making, you could say, are embodied in and practiced through the way we make maps about those worlds. I also taught a class with a philosopher called Thinking Through Interfaces, where we imagined how we could, again, kind of reduce or crystallize a world through a data interface. And that includes everything from like slot machines to keyboards. You might know Tom Mulaney's book, The Chinese Keyboard, where we're thinking about a whole cosmology or ontology of a culture that just does not allow itself to be reduced into the standard QWERTY keyboard. So how do even something as seemingly kind of quotidian as the design of a typing interface really warp or allow for the full engagement with a worldview? We looked at musical interfaces, keyboards, haptic technologies. So these are the ways that we can design interfaces to engage with the world that is being mediated through them. I will also note that this is the website that got me in trouble, which really changed, I would say, rocked my world in a terrible way. I have built open access websites for all of my classes since 2002. And in this case, I had a photograph of a slot machine, a different one than this one that you see right here, that I pulled from Creative Commons license on Flickr. 3 years later, in 2022, a commercial photographer wrote the New School and noted that that was his photograph and that he wanted $250,000 in damages because by putting it on my website, which he claimed I was selling, I was damaging his ability to make money on that photograph. In the United States, we have this thing called fair use, where if it's used for non-commercial educational purposes, it's a carve out from copyright law. My use was clearly within the realm of fair use, but the New School declined to defend me, even though all the artists and designers in the New School do creative appropriation of copyrighted materials all the time. It's a right you have to fight for, so that you can make art and do scholarship. So this really kind of made me a little bit, I guess, gun shy, to use a very American metaphor. So I really make sure to cross my I's and dot my T's and do not take the same risks that I did before with claiming fair use for copyright, even though it is fully within my rights to do so. That was a really traumatic experience that extended for 3 years. It was a 3-year fight until I ran out the statute of limitations. If only my employer, who loved my websites up until then, would be willing to stand in and say, wait a second, this is clearly a legitimate fair use. I wouldn't have had to go through that, but that was a world-shaping experience for me. By putting all of my course data online, I opened myself up to risk of nefarious, kind of disingenuous actors that really shaped the way I now engage with the digital world. I've also, over the years, where a lot of my research intersects with ARITS, is about smart cities. So here I taught for a couple years, 2017, 18, I think 19, also a class called Urban Intelligence, where we thought about and read a lot of ARITS work about smart cities, and then thought about, as the smartness mandate kind of posits, like, what does it mean to call something smart? What are some other adjectives and metrics and standards we can use for thinking about intelligence and knowledge more capaciously? What other types of wisdom are embedded into our urban environments that don't lend themselves to datification and quantification? So this was a pretty speculative class. We also looked at like the history of trying to datify urban environments. And then the class I taught at the switch from on-site to virtual during the pandemic, the spring of 2022, I taught a class called Data Artifacts, Infrastructures, and Landscapes, where we looked at the history and a whole range of species of worlds that are defined by their data organization and legibility. So container ports, factory farms, logistical systems, and a range of other environments where we're trying to map out flows and surveil in people. We also had a week where we talked about resisting. So how can we obfuscate or render ourselves unintelligible or unperceptible to a machine? This is around the types of things I was writing about around the same time. Again, thinking about more about sound. So I was writing about sonic archaeologies and what we can learn by listening to systems. So this was really informed by the urban intelligence class. So both forms of kind of immediate forms of listening with the ears. What can we learn about a city by listening to its rhythms? And then with the rise of machine listening, what types of sometimes surveillance or criminal justice oriented, policing oriented, even and now with immigration enforcement, how can we weaponize listening technologies for those purposes? So a lot of these combined interests, most of my work is about thinking about how the data works with the physical. So how the virtual and the physical are always entwined in a data world. And that work was encoded in a book that I published in 2017 called Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, where I'm looking at how cities have always been smart for their entire existence for 5,000 years. If you go all the way back to like Uruk and Catalhoyuk, with the writing on clay, tablets, for instance, and the making of buildings out of clay. So how making marks, counting things, documenting things, tracking things was an integral part of urban development and urban design for the entire history of cities. So this book really is like the grand scale, Lewis Mumford kind of scale exploration of how the data or the physical and the virtual are always entangled in a data world. Just other things that I was thinking about in some of my shorter form publications. Again, I know some of you are interested in environmental data, environmental science. So I wrote a piece about how rocks and clay and coral and tree rings can all serve as data sources to help us understand the physical, geophysical world. This was a project I wrote about a project that was supposed to happen, a piece I wrote, excuse me, about a project that was in planning, happening at NYU, where they would track 10,000 people throughout the city and map every interaction they had between their bodies, all the sensors on their bodies and the physical environment, so that you could then in a positivist way, design a city that was going to maximize optimal performance and health. All kinds of risks and kind of privacy concerns here. This project ultimately did not come to fruition. I can't say that my expose caused that, but it was like a warning sign of this is what's to come if we are thinking in this purely very Silicon Valley oriented instrumentalist optimization modality of about how to train our bodies and how to design our cities if they can get the most out of each other. Also, there was a smart city project that does exist in New York City. It was supposed to be kind of this exemplar of smart technologies. That part didn't quite come to fruition, but the city does exist now, this urban development. I wrote about the aspirations for Hudson Yards on the far west side of Manhattan. And here we see another great example of something that happens often in data worlds is the layering of infrastructures. So you have, for example, pre-data oriented information technologies, the telegraph, the railroad. Those tend to provide very convenient substrates and kind of legal permissions, rights of way, easements, etc., that allow them for the layering, both metaphorical and literal, of new technologies on top of them, which is why we see, in a classical map you've probably seen, a lot of the fiber optic cables that crisscross the world under the oceans follow the same lines that the telegraphs did. So just this, here we see the old train lines then become this substrate for New York's supposed smart city kind of experimental space. So here's the kind of the health optimization project I was talking about. Also, this was the age of the first Trump, when we were already aghast by the way surveillance technologies and machine vision were used as border tracking. Now we have turned that dial up to 12. It is beyond what I think anybody thought was possible, or I think people thought it was possible. It's just that we didn't know that the degree of evil was something we could attain. So this was a piece where I looked at the way that human beings are operationalized through machine vision and listening in a way that is purely alien. I would say purely, but highly alienating and instrumentalizing for the purpose of securing borders and othering populations who aren't wanted. And we have taken this to a new extreme with the second Trump administration. was also really interested in what happened with maps when we look at different ways of organizing space, of conceiving territory and our stewardship of land through different approaches to mapping. So this is I'm looking at everything from like how salmon navigate up a river to how pigeons orient themselves in the sky to how self-driving cars see the world as volumes, as certain reflective surfaces. So the way technologies kind of ontologize all the things in our worlds to help with navigation, mapping, and increasingly with the quantification and monetization of those environments and extraction also. At the same time, I didn't want to be entirely a bummer, all pessimistic, so I wanted to look at how the datification of our worlds can actually produce really useful to communities, for activism, for social justice. So if you have data about your world and spatial trap patterns and the layerings of historical phenomena, particularly as manifested through things like open data sets and map libraries, how that could be empowering to communities. So that's what this whole article was about, was map libraries and public data and the potentially beneficial uses to which it could be put. Oops, I just lost my place here. Just a second. All right. So I was also doing, in addition to teaching and scholarship, a lot of work like public design projects. So I have been able to like organize our department speaker series, work with different galleries and cultural organizations around the city to do some projects that allow us to explore a lot of these same questions about the entanglement of the virtual and the physical in urban and non-urban environments. So, for instance, I work with the Storefront for Art and Architecture, an experimental gallery, to think about how we could think through with environmental scientists and urban planners and technologists all the impossible and practical ways we can use technologies in cities. This was a project I did with the media scholar Jussi Parikka in Helsinki, timed with the opening of their new public library, the Udi, the really beautiful Udi building in Helsinki, to think about other intelligences. So we worked with the Finnish artist Jenna Sutela to think about slime molds and other species intelligence, with Tuomas Latinen to think about bees and other types of kind of environmental and ecological knowledge, and with Samir Bomik to think about infrastructural intelligences. In the interest of time, I'm just going to really quickly highlight some of these. So also thinking about maps, the good and bad uses to which maps could be used. Again, public spatial data in urban development projects, and how some companies like Google, for instance, can really tap into and exploit the cleverly designed charismatic presentation of public data as a way of having people buy into otherwise very nefarious extractive types of urban development projects. They wanted to build a big smart city project in Toronto and used all these kind of folksy aesthetics of presentation of data to placate people, to put a friendly face on the project. Ultimately didn't go through because people saw through the cosmetic sheen to realize that there was a lot of more privacy compromising and not so publicly beneficial things in the background. The pandemic also made me think about maps a lot more. So with this supposed stasis of logistics, with people standing still, what type of mapping is possible? Like what things are happening in the background that we're not seeing to allow us to zoom in from our homes while we're all supposedly stationary during the pandemic? So this was a piece about how do we map nothing and what's the chaos that's happening behind that nothing. Here's the piece I mentioned earlier about, engaging with, again, how we can find data in the material world. So here's the one I kind of think I mentioned this earlier about how we can find data in ice and rocks and core samples of sediments. And then I wanted to think about trees because honestly, I was getting a little tired of thinking about data. Most of the talks I was invited to give were about kind of purely virtual data-based things, data sets, urban data. And I really wanted to be, especially in the pandemic, because I was on screen all the time, wanted to literally touch grass. So I started to think about trees and how trees have historically been a place where data are constructed, where communities gather to share knowledge. They provide an epistemological model for a lot of our algorithms with like random forests and decision trees, for instance. So just the rhizomatic and arboreal models for organizing information and all the persistence of the tree as a thing to think with throughout information history. And then, really helpful for me is that I was in a media studies department for about 15 years. And then I moved over to an anthropology department. I was asked to move to a different division of the new school to start a new program in anthropology and design. And this was like a necessary refresh for me. I had been pulled, typecast as a good team player, a heavy service provider in our department. So I wanted to move to a new environment and maybe reset. But also being exposed to a different discipline. I had been doing ethnographic research in the past, but just being immersed in it helped me to appreciate what I did and didn't like about it. But it also helped me think about data in a different way, especially ethnographic data, field data. So I co-taught a class with a friend of mine who works in community networks about what if we were to design new, non-extractive, public service-oriented communication infrastructures, how could ethnographic work and community engagement help us design those more equitably, justly, effectively, etc. So applying anthropological methods to the design of networks. I also, during the pandemic, taught a class on digital ethnography just because the onlineness of our lives really lent itself to exploring this. And the context kind of rendered these types of methods newly salient for everybody, regardless of whether their work research had previously focused on digital technologies or not. Also, stepping further away from the fetishization of data and the onlineness and virtuality of everything, I wanted to think more about maintenance. So this was a project that preceded the pandemic, but it proved like especially resonant for me and others during the pandemic. Started to write about maintenance and care. This was also where I was really tapping into my own biography. I grew up in a hardware store. My dad is a furniture maker. My mom taught special education to people with multiple disabilities. So just thinking about all of the care work that I was surrounded by growing up, I wanted to honor that in a way that most data-driven ways of thinking did not recognize. So that really was reflected, that honoring what my parents taught me really was something that informed a lot of my research. That maintenance piece then led to another one where I was looking at the history of the repair manual and how this could be a model for thinking about wicked problems, big, sticky, obfuscating systems, all the way down to our little gadgets. What does and doesn't lend itself to repair? And some of these projects were then brought together and recontextualized in my book, A City is Not a Computer. This was published in 2021. Then I was recruited for some different jobs. I chose poorly, chose to go to the University of Pennsylvania, which was ultimately not a great fit for me. And shortly after, we had, as you probably know, the campus protests. Penn was kind of a model of how not to handle it justly and inclusively, but also very early on, they were one of the first schools to have an official agreement with OpenAI. So just buying into the inevitability of artificial intelligence and incorporating that throughout the curriculum. So here I had just published a book about a city not being a computer, about recognizing and securing and protecting other ways of knowledge, where I was now in a place where knowledge was highly instrumentalized and financialized. Like the primary metric of achievement was your starting salary once you finished your degree. And this proved to be a very alienating environment for me because our data worlds, I guess I could say, did not mesh. Simultaneously, there was this data-driven discovery initiative there, and I noticed that it was run by a criminal justice person and an astrophysicist. All hard sciences and the applied, mostly criminal justice-oriented social sciences. No artists, no designers, no humanists. I offered myself up the first semester. They did not take that offer. To this day, at least the last time I checked, there are still 0 humanists. or artists and designers on this committee, which says a lot about the way this particular institution and so many elite institutions regard how they circumscribe their own data worlds, what data mean to them. Simultaneously, in the outside world, while I was realizing I found myself in an educational environment and a data world that felt very alien to me, where I couldn't do the work that I cared about, I was seeing all the stuff that I and Arit and other smart cities, and urban technology scholars had been writing caveats about for a decade or 15 or 20 years. They just kept coming. So Saudi Arabia had its NEOM project. There was just a piece in the Financial Times about, especially with these new populist right-wing regimes in place around the world, there are a lot of tech bros who are doing essentially data colonialism, starting up private cities, testbed urbanism, to use Arit's phrase, all over the place. So despite decade plus of scholarship warning about the dangers, we now have people in place who not only were ignorant of and could not care less about that scholarship, but they're kind of actively making it happen, paving the way to eliminate regulations, to eliminate environmental protections, to allow these types of things to flourish, which is pretty depressing considering when you spend, a good portion of your career talking about how to maybe do these things not at all or more safely and equitably. More recently, especially in the United States, with its love of guns and destruction, we see military contractors, just newly empowered. So we have tons of people who are trying to build defense technologies, a lot of cities to reinvigorate their pandemic-starved downtowns are now opening the doors, throwing the gates open to defense contractors. Just think about what type of an urban world you're building when it's built around the logics of defense technologies. Also, I'm seeing that especially with the rise, people are now general public is newly conscious of the environmental impacts of data centers. So there's been some new, popular press writing about the environmental impacts, the fact that when you build a new AI mega data center in your community, often rural disenfranchised communities, they suddenly can't drink their water anymore. Their electricity prices suddenly triple. This is a revelation to some people. I really regret that people, politicians, journalists had not been paying attention to the fact that for 10 years plus, scholars in media studies and geography had been writing, history of technology, had been writing about data centers. Again, these caveats that had just unfortunately not been heeded in the larger policy and practical world. We also see Doge, Elon Musk, the tech bros of the worst, most nefarious tech bros suddenly being legitimated and allowed to run rampant through federal government. This is the real downer part of my talk, as you can see. It's the sign that just the real frustration that the decade plus, 2 decades of really brilliant scholarship just unfortunately had very little impact as the folks who could serve as stopgaps were pushed out of government. Palantir, the federal government, the National Health Service in the UK has entered into a devil's bargain with Palantir. Palantir is all over the federal government in the United States right now, cross-referencing data sets so they can target people. So the worst people in the tech world are now in leadership positions to do real damage. And then Trump is also all in on AI because, somebody came to a dinner and gave him a lot of money. He knows nothing about it. He just knows that it's good for him. So he's actually going to try to block states like New York and California, who try to regulate AI. So all of this was a bit of a bummer for me. So the bad institutional context and the state of the world. So I made a big career shift. So I know that one of the questions that Johanna's going to ask me later is about some of those changes. So I'm happy to talk about that. I don't want to, go into that, but I wrote some blog posts about what I just had got run out of opportunities to say no or to decline, and I was just exhausted. So eventually realized when my personal health was compromised that I had to maybe make a shift. So I left the academy. I resigned in June of this year. And now I work with an organization on whose board I had served for a decade. I am forever grateful, made a job for me. This is the Metropolitan New York Library Council, a very different way of thinking about a public interest data world. So this is an organization founded by the state of New York. There are 9 of us around the state. It's kind of like a geographic commons. All the libraries and archives and culture institutions in New York City and Westchester County can work together to build technologies together, to share resources. This is a very different kind of way of conceiving of and manifesting a data world than what you see like in a Palantir or X or Twitter oriented world. I am the director of creative research there, which allows me to think creatively about what constitutes data. Well, how does it become wisdom? So some of the projects we're doing are building an ecological library in Westchester County, just north of the city, thinking about how do the trees and rocks and rainfall and flora and all kinds of things in that field constitute knowledge objects in and of themselves. How do we preserve them or let them decay? How do we catalog them in non-colonialist ways? So it's a field of experimentation for really thinking about building our own data world. And then I created a little experimental syllabus for the syllabus project last summer, highlighting some of the critical discourse in myriad fields, from biology to environmental science to creative engineering, to think about some of those questions about what can we play with, what data infrastructures can we play with on the field. I also started a new experimental school that bridges the libraries and archives in the city. And each semester we have a new theme that is in a way also about cultivating a nice collegial, hospitable cohort to think about building our own data worlds. The first class was about the misfit. So as in our society, all those people who do not fit, who don't have the right immigration papers, who are in the wrong place at the wrong time, who do not fit into one gender category or another, all those people have been marginalized, pejoratized, pathologized, incriminated. We wanted to celebrate the misfit, the people, the ideas, the institutions who don't fit and will not comply. So this is, again, we're kind of building celebrating the messiness of things that don't fit a data model. And then I have a whole slide deck I put together for our board showing some of the places we've been, like the Botanic Garden, talking about queer ecologies and species that don't fit, to looking at misfit publications at Printed Matter and Art Bookshop, to making our own boxes at the Center for Book Arts and figuring out what doesn't fit in a box. And then the last thing I'll say is we're doing a call right now for our next class in the spring, which is about search and discovery. And I'm just going to read this paragraph and then I'll stop. And I realize I've gone way too long, and I'm sorry for that. I had no idea this would take me so long. But this class is about search and discovery. So search engine optimization and generative AI have progressively destroyed web search. They have circumscribed our data worlds available online. New, possibly supposedly horizon expanding technologies have broken our technologies of search and discovery, which actually constricts the worlds we have access to. And you probably know, with their spiders crawling the web, they are actually destabilizing and debilitating repositories. So it's actually constricting the data world we have access to. Meanwhile, expanding privatization, surveillance, and the militarization of our public spaces have impeded our capacity to explore and inhabit the physical world. And the instrumentalization and optimization of education have impeded organic, curiosity-driven investigation. So in this course in the spring, we'll gather to survey the state of search and discovery, reopen those worlds, reclaim lost methods, explore strategies for circumventing automation, extraction, probably surveillance also, imagine new modes of orienteering, and conjure up new terrains of wonderment. So again, I know I'm gone way too far, so I will stop there, but this is kind of a note of possibility. I have found a space, an institution that I think affords more possibility, creates a more capacious world to do things that I think are more meaningful right now. And I think allowing people to explore ways to reopen up their worlds to kindness, hospitality, responsibility, consent, values that I would prefer and other people would prefer to live by, in a way to counter those that are embodied in our federal government and elsewhere right now, and our tech companies. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for this super relevant and wonderful talk. I just have to say, I'm a huge fan of your website, and I think your open access work is so relevant because I'm on your website almost every day, which is probably also reflected on the question that I'm going to ask. And this was just so very activating, your talk. So I hope we can have like a very nice discussion even after the recording stopped. I think since we've already ahead of the schedule. The time has passed. I'm going to skip the first question, if that's okay, and head into the second question, because you actually just mentioned your ecological outdoor library, which I also looked into and I thought was really, really interesting. And this kind of goes into the question that I had, especially as someone who's in environmental studies in the past when it comes to data, especially with the Trump administration, the data is being deleted, but also with the just the whole ecological crises going on when it comes to data. I'm wondering, from your perspective, how might we rethink data management and preservation when the archives of our planet are increasingly shaped by both ecological processes, but also political power?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those, you might have seen that meme where it's like somebody saying like, "Oh, you critiqued society, yet you live in society." So it's like this thing you cannot get out. How can you live in a capitalist society and benefit from it while still critiquing it? I think first of all, it's just to recognize that there's no such thing as purity politics, that you have to exist within your most base existence requires you to kind of live within the limitations of the system that you unfortunately are trapped into living within. So absolving yourself of the need to be pure about your politics, because that is impossible. So that's one thing. I think also I kind of lost my next train of thought. Realizing that things at this moment don't necessarily have to scale. So obviously, I think this moment also maybe absolves us of this um, naturalization of scaling, of growing, of transporting ideas outward, that making an idea or a model or a project that has to move somewhere else, that has to get bigger. That's just not possible right now. So I think that there are lots of little pockets of experimentation, of justice-oriented initiatives that have to stay small right now, both because they don't want to draw attention to themselves, or because even their ethics of operation require that they be very locally rooted. So there are some projects we can look to. So I think our library field, that's not going to be something that's going to scale across the country. Maybe if our country has a huge swing away from this current administration and the next administration, we're going to have decades of rebuilding infrastructures that have been destroyed. But I think that drawing some ecological metaphors and methods could be useful in that rebuilding. I am speaking very hopefully. I hope we have the possibility to do this sometime, that it's not just a perpetual downward slope. But also, I think that especially with the damage that the proliferating AI infrastructure is doing, that we have to have some counter infrastructures that embody different, values of sustainability. I'll give you one other tiny example. This is also drawn from an institution where I work, and that is within the Metro Library Council, we have a digital repositories team called Archipelago, which builds OpenStack digital repositories to work with different kind of cultural institutions to embody the values that matter to their institutions. So for many years, even seemingly virtuous institutions like universities, we now know that they're pretty nefarious too, but like libraries, they have to work with really bad commercial vendors. So just even to have access to our research, they have to work with the Elsevier's and the Taylor and Francis and the Wileys of the world, whose business models are just as entangled with kind of criminal justice and surveillance data as they are with academic research. So for their medical schools and their scientists to have access to knowledge they need to do their work, they have to buy licenses with really bad companies that try to extract as much value for themselves from freely produced research or government-funded research. So I think some folks, as their budgets have been cut, have been looking for alternatives. So at Metro, we had like New York Public Radio as one of our clients right now. They had their budget massively cut. They can no longer afford the proprietary software they had been using to maintain their archives. So they're working with our little two-person team to build a whole repository using technologies that embody values that matter to public media, not those that matter to a company that wants to monetize their archives as much as possible. So this is, again, something that can't scale. It's a slow process. It's full of friction. But also, I think that if they build something really cool, for a big organization like New York Public Media, Public Radio, other organizations will see like, I don't have to work with this out of the box extractive company anymore. There are alternatives to the commercial vendors, the extractive commercial vendors. So I think this is maybe where looking at, some of the projects we are doing, I don't mean to be totally like self-reflexive here and say like ours are the only ones to look to, but there are lots of like community organizing, even in cities around the country right now, as ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is entering a lot of American cities. Trump is sicking this force, which is mostly thugs, teams of thugs who are going into democratic cities. People are using whistle relays. So using the old model of whistles with different, almost like Morse code, like compositions to warn people what's happening. That's data. That's organic sonic data from grassroots. I mean, that's a really lovely thing to look at too, about how people can germinate their own models, non-scalable, that are really locally rooted and embody a different kind of set of ethics and values. So those are just some examples to look at.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm also very excited to see your work then at the library and the archives you will create. The next question that I have is also something that is very much reflected in your website. Me as a PhD, I really look into also the coursework that you put online. It's very important. And the methodologies, especially as someone who's an interdisciplinary, even cross-disciplinary scholar, I think this is interesting for all of us here in the Zoom call, since we are kind of in the intersection of social science, humanities, and technology studies. Your website is very helpful for people like us. But I'm also wondering, just you as such a interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary scholar, do you have any advice for us working across disciplines, especially like how can we move beyond the boundaries of a single field and meaningfully engage also with methodologies and theories of other fields?
I was a chemistry major for 3 years as an undergraduate, ultimately graduated as an English major. But I think that having that experience to a different data world, a different epistemological landscape, different methodologies, different models of producing knowledge, different idea of like a knowledge community was really useful. And it also prepared me to read some literature that might be impenetrable to people who have like a purely humanities oriented training. I think also growing up in a crafty family where it's like a lot, my dad didn't finish college, so he knew how to make anything. He knows how to fix anything and make anything. And just knowing that improvisatory way of figuring something out, trying stuff, breaking it, fixing it, like that's not something that is germane and comfortable to a lot of academics, but that was really great for me to grow up in a place where like I can just play around with scraps of woods and nails and make something and then rip it apart. So having those knowledges or those data worlds modeled for me was really helpful. I also say that interdisciplinarity is hard. It takes more time. You have to read more widely. If you want to be taken seriously in multiple fields, or at least, I don't mean this to sound like it is a gatekeepy thing, especially if you want to advance in the traditional trajectory through the academy. But if you want to feel like you're doing justice to and engaging in good faith with the disciplines you're drawing together, and to help the people in those fields that you're tying together feel like you're doing justice to their work, you got to read a lot. You got to talk to a lot of people. So that increases your workload. But ultimately, I feel like it produces much more meaningful scholarship because problems like environmental health or public health or urban life, these are not the purview of a single discipline. Like these persistent challenges that have driven you all to do your research are much more productively and meaningfully considered through kind of the collaborative knowledges of multiple fields. Which is why, thinking across, modeling some of that cross-pollination in your own work can be really useful. What else was I going to say? I will also mention that I know that the new school is a fraught environment, and I know Arit can attest to that as well. But I will say that, like having my formative experience in an art school, a school where art and design was kind of at the forefront, allowed for an environment of much more epistemological experimentation. I know that Arit happened to have the misfortune of being in the more traditionally kind of discipline-minded and protectionist field or division of that university, but I was in one that was pretty loosey-goosey. And that had faults, but it was also allowed for a lot of possibility. So I now realize, after having spent 18, almost 19 years in an art school, and then moving to a pretty traditional elite academic institution, I would never have stayed in the academy if I had started at Penn. It was so prescribed and protectionist of disciplinary boundaries that that would have been, first of all, incredibly boring to me. And I would have been paranoid all the time. So I'm actually, in retrospect, for all the new school's faults and cruelties and exploitation, I'm grateful that I was in a more exploratory type of environment where art made ideas seem possible that wouldn't have seemed possible elsewhere. So I'd say like engaging with artists and designers just to expand your brain has been really fruitful. Um, yeah, I'm. I think that's where I'll stop.
No, those are really great answers. I also think it really depends on what kind of field you're in and the possibilities you have as an interdisciplinary researcher also. The last question I have before we open this up is my question for your recent work that you're now doing outside of academia. I think for us PhDs now in our last year, almost last year, it's very interesting to also reflect on our possible futures inside and outside of the academia. And I mean, I read your post, your blog post, Long Goodbye, which was super interesting and also reflected your early career uncertainties, which I could really relate to. And it was very nice to read. But I'm also just wondering to hear about your experiences more, but also for us to know what it is like to transition from academia to a more project-based work environment outside of academia, and also what should we prepare for when we stay inside of academia, or are there maybe meaningful alternatives? Because I think not all of us can stay inside of academia.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure, again, Arit can probably add more because she now has the comparative experience of US and EU academic contexts. But in my case, I would say it took me about almost 25 years to be completely disillusioned, to realize that, all of these things that have been naturalized, like you have to engage in the peer review process, like because you need to prop up junior scholars, like you've climbed up the ladder, so now it's your obligation to help those below you, and I did that. But then I also realized that around me, the system was becoming ever more impossible. So I think it's over 60% of all faculty in the United States now are adjuncts. At the new school, it was 87%. So of all the classes, only 13% were taught by full-time faculty. When you have a system that relies on the production of scholarship, free labor in publication, for instance, people doing reviews for grants, the whole industry relies on a volunteer economy, most of it not compensated, most of it on top of your already existing job description. And you have a tiny, infinite, like increasingly, or I would say decreasingly, or decreasing size population who can handle that work. That means a huge amount of work and a growing amount of work for the people who do have the secure jobs to do it. After a while, I realized, like, sure, I can just keep, working 90 hours a week to keep doing all of this because I feel ethically obligated to my colleagues, but also like I can't fix the system, and sadly, it's getting worse. So that's the point where when I landed in the hospital for a week for the first time in my life, that's when I realized like the universe has told me something. Like that is correct. You cannot keep doing this. So that was really a wake up call for me. And it took me a very long time to be disillusioned. I will say that I'm talking to a lot of, because since I have left and been not entirely quiet about my frustrations in recent years, I've had a lot of conversations with almost graduating PhD students, postdocs, who get in the job and realize like, I'm not sure if I want this. I was told all along that like I have to be one track mind. I can't have a family. I can't have hobbies. I got to keep going for this. And there was like, I see you and other people, and I'm not sure this is, I saw my senior male professors in undergrad and thought like, that's the life I want. Those jobs don't exist anymore. They exist for them. They're the last generation. So I think it was a lot of people are having questions about other possibilities. I think, the job I found, I'm really grateful. I am very lucky. Part of it is that I had a 25-year track record to draw on that was visible to people in that other organization. Also, I did 10 years of volunteer labor as a board member for them. So I already kind of paid forward some that incented them to make a job for me. I know other people who were going into government work, like some cities, like New York City government is a really hopeful place right now. We have a new mayor that is a ray of hope. So a lot of academics are thinking like, I'm going to go work in civil service for a few years. There are foundations like the Mellon Foundation, the big funders, which still are committed to social justice. That is an appealing potential place of work or collaboration for a lot of people who don't think they really want the academy. Maybe the United States Academy will have like a recorrection period. I just think that it's a really fraught place right now, and red states governments are trying to push people out. You might know that there's a person named Russ Vought in the federal government who years ago said, like, we want to traumatize these people. We want to make it so they do not want to wake up in the morning and go to work. They want to push people out by making them hate their jobs. There are state legislatures who are trying to do that to faculty in red states right now, and it's happening. So I would say it's necessary, especially if you have any aspirations to work in the American Academy, to think other places, because at least for the next several years, it's not going to get better, and it's going to take many years to rebuild, I think. But there are places of hope, like, city government or civil society type of things. Again, a REIT might have some recommendations based on what your specific geographic context is.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for also being so honest and open with us. It was super engageful and meaningful to listen to you talk. I would say we will stop the recording now.